Hi there, students. In furtherance to this lecture that we have on comparative environmental law with specific reference to animal welfare laws, I thought of discussing about, besides United States and animal welfare laws that we have discussed in previous lectures, I thought of discussing some other countries also at the same point of time. Those countries, especially, I picked one here, which, in fact, has the record of having strictest and animal welfare law in the world, and this is the federal animal law of Austria, which is believed to be one of the strictest animal welfare laws in the world. And the basic reason behind this is that, in fact, unlike many other countries where the debate of whether animals have rights, etc., still kind of brewing up, when it comes to Austria, the animal cruelty law that they have, it is believed to be the crucial and as well as very strictest even in entire Europe, because here they, in fact, bestows this animal as an entity which is quite equivalent to that of the mankind. So they place animals to such highest regard. The protection and well-being of animals have been valued, which is equivalent to mankind or humanity. So this is what the Austrian, animal welfare laws they have. So that's why I have decided to discuss the, cardinal principles which guide their laws with respect to animal welfare in Australia, and pick their legislation, their crucial legislation, commonly known as the Austrian Animal Welfare Act of 2004. But if you go by the true name of so-called the legislative, the legal title, it is the Federal Act on Protection of Animals 2004. Federal Act on Protection of Animals 2004. Now, this Federal Act on Protection of Animals Act 2004, it basically aims at the protection of life and the well-being of animals based on man's special responsibility for the animals as a fellow creature. So, as a fellow creature, when you're saying that, it means that you're putting animals and man in the equal balance, and you are bestowing a special responsibility upon the man for taking care of the animals, because they are also their fellow creatures, so just like humans. So, and this particular Federal Act of Protection of Animals 2004 of Austria, it applies to all the animals. And in this particular law, it does not affect any other allied legislations. Like, for example, they have this Animal Experiments Act of 2012, Animal Transportation Act of 2007. It doesn't affect these other allied legislation. So the prime objective of this law is to protect the protection of the life and well-being of animals based on man's special responsibility for the animal as a fellow creature. And if you refer to the scope of this particular legislation, as I mentioned, there's these legislations, other legislation which doesn't get affected are there. Now, the subject where the Federal Act shall not apply, to hunting and fishing, because there are certain listed activities which are not considered to be a matter of hunting and fishing under this particular federal law of Austria. I'll refer it hereinafter as Austrian animal law. So the Austrian animal law, it keeps the hunting and fishing, this federal act, it's not applicable, it's not applied to hunting and fishing, and the certain activities are not considered to be matter of hunting and fishing, which in fact deals with keeping the animals used for support of hunting and fishing, then keeping certain animals in enclosures for other purpose than hunting, and also for keeping the fish or fishes for other purpose than fishing. So that is there. Now, in addition to that, this particular legislation touches upon several important key elements. Now, the thing is that, as I have already mentioned, this legislation shall not apply to hunting and fishing, keeping animals in enclosures which is there other than hunting, and fishing which is for the purpose other than fishing. That was the scope. Now, this federal legislation, the Austrian animal law, it in fact defines any person who is responsible for an animal, whether on a permanent basis or temporary basis, and that individual has a special responsibility to take care of that animal, right? So as a human, we are so-called keeper. So keeper is the term that they have used as per their law, that any person who is responsible for an animal, whether on permanent or temporary basis, or having an animal in care, right? They have also kind of defined domestic animals, pets, wild animals. So then these are the basic three categories where you will find that the domestic animals have been defined as those animals which are domesticated of certain genuses like cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, horses, and of course, with an exception of exotic species. When it comes to the pets, they have mentioned that all those animals which are kept within the household, okay, as a companion or because of the interest in the animal, and as far as possible, the domestic and domesticated animals of be it carnivorous, be it a rodent, be it parrots, finches, pigeon-like birds, etc., etc. They are all part and parcel of pets as per the definition. And then comes the wild animals. All animals except the domestic and pet animals are wild animals as per the Section 4 of the Federal Act of Animal Protection, so called the Australian Animal Law. Now, the animals which are kept for farming purposes have been also defined. In addition to that, fodder animals has been defined like fish, domestic poultry. That has been defined like mice, rats, hamsters, usually rabbits also, which are held and killed for purposes of fodder, for using as fodder. This is something which they have also defined. So they have also defined animals kept for farming purposes, fodders animals. In addition to that, they have also looked into other important aspects which are related. In fact, zoos are part of this particular legislation. Like for example, in India, we have a central zoo authority now after the amendment of the Wildlife Protection Act, right? But there they have already defined zoos as a permanent establishment where the wild animals are those animals which are, except the domestic and pet animals, all these animals are so-called wild animals. So the permanent establishments where these so-called wild animals are kept for exhibition purpose to the public, which ranges from 7 days to a year, with an exception of circuses and pet shops. So circuses and pet shops where you will also come across wild animals, they are not the zoos. But other than that, all the so-called permanent establishments, it should be a permanent establishment. So that has been defined. Circus has also been defined. This is a good beauty of this particular legislation. Circus has been defined as an institution which usually offers certain performance, right, of animals and all. So they have also, because you will come across this, in circuses. I don't know if you have ever been to any circus, but I have been there. And back then, when I was a kid, the government laws, they in fact allowed the tigers and the lions and even elephants and all. So I'm not sure what is the situation now, but coming across several other countries and their practices, well, when it comes to the Australian animal law, circus has been defined, which I didn't find in our Wildlife Protection Act by any chance. So, but I have to refer to this Prevention Against Cruelty of Animals Act and see whether they deal with the area of circus. But of course, it is applicable because, if I'm not wrong, Section 11 of Prevention of Cruelty of Animals is applicable to any person, right? So, the circus is an institution which usually is responsible, and if you are engaging any animals for acrobatic performances or funny shows, those breeds of the dogs where they used to perform this acrobatic performances, I remember. So they are also part and parcel of this particular law. However, in addition to that, the other definitions which are very crucial, it takes into consideration the gaming, which is there in Austria. Gaming is something where a particular season is there, and only those animals are required to be are permitted to be hunted. So hoofed gaming is there. So they have kept a category of hoofed game where they have put the red deer, the fallow deer, and then there's something called Shikaniban deer, then Peary David's deer, also known as Milu. They have this wild boar also and mouflon. So these are some of the so-called hoofed game animals which are part of this particular legislation. And in addition to zoos and circus, they have also referred to something called variety show. Now, this variety show is basically those institutions which offer certain performances, mainly for entertainment purposes, like for musical performances or any other alternatives, artistic performances, dance, etc., etc. And finally, slaughtering has been defined under the Austrian animal law, which means killing of any animal by extraction of blood and consequent disemboweling for the purpose of meat production. So this is something which has been clearly mentioned. Section 5 is something important with respect to the Austrian animal law, because there they have clearly mentioned around 16 such prohibitions, which are kind of which amounts to cruelty to animals. So please do refer to section 5 of this federal act, which prohibits, if any person who increases the aggressiveness and fighting readiness of any animals by one-sided breeding, or use spike collars or technical equipments devices for, which creates a lot of problem for that particular animal, create a pain in fact, and then you have the set of animals or other animals who are trained for aggressive purposes. Then if you organize or performs any animal fights, then dog races is also something which is prohibited there. So you cannot organize dog race on asphalt or any other hard covered terrain. You can do it in other ways, but in asphalt racing you have seen, that hard covered terrain where you cannot, because what if the dog gets injured? So that is also that they have taken into consideration. Wow. Now in addition to that, if you are using animals for films, advertising, exhibitions, which involves pain, suffering, injury, heavy fear, that is also prohibited. If you are administering certain stimulants or doping substances to their animal in order to increase its performances, that is also prohibited. If you're exposing an animal to temperature, weather conditions, lack of oxygen, restriction of freedom of movement, that is a prohibition. If you're even offering an animal food or substances, that is kind of, if it ingested, then it will cause pain, suffering, heavy fear, that is prohibited. Then if you're forcing an animal to ingest a food and substances which is not necessary for as a veterinary medicine, that is prohibited. If you're even negligently not paying due regard, and you're not taking care of the accommodation, you're not feeding, you're not caring your animal, and because of which that animal is suffering, incurring pain, injury, that is something that also amounts to cruelty of the animals. If you're even abandoning, leaving a domestic or a pet animal, that amounts, in order to get rid of that animal, that is also a crime. Can you believe it? Then you have, if you have serious, if you just cut the limbs, or many times, some, you will find that they also pierce the animals with certain things. Piercing is something which you will also find in some countries, where they pierce certain things in the bodies of the animal parts. In Austria, that is also prohibited. So you cannot in fact do that. You cannot in fact sever the limb for live animals, from live animals, and you cannot also use catching devices in a way to, for catching purposes, which is of course, in a way, which is not catching unharmed or not killing immediately. So you cannot do that also. So these are some of the list of prohibited activities which are pretty much there mentioned under the Australian animals law. There is also a prohibition of killing animals. In fact, it is prohibited to kill animals without a proper reason, but you can have a reason for the same. So it is prohibited to kill a dog or a cat for the purpose of manufacturing food. Then killing of any animals for educational training and research purposes is allowed only if it is performed by any scientific institution, and it is only admissible to the extent that is indispensable for reaching a particular objective. So you have to be very clear with that. So this is something which is to be done, and this is something, because for educational purposes you might have to dissect a particular animal for veterinary sciences, and also that is why they have certain proviso clauses also, which has to be taken into consideration. For that, please refer to section 6 of the same. Then when it comes to prohibited interventions performed on the animals, then there are certain things, as I was mentioning, that for example, some animals, they the dogs tails and all, they what they do is they dock the tails. So docking of the tails is not allowed, that is also prohibited. Then if you want to change the phenotypic appearance of a dog, you want to make the dog look more, vicious and something like that, they do things like that. This is the thing, and veterinarians are also involved in such activities. So in a way, these operations which in fact aims to change the phenotypic phenotype genotypes in the language of genetics. So phenotypic appearance of an animal, that is also prohibited. If you want to crop the ear, or you want to devocalize it, or declaw, defang, in order to defang or declaw also, if you go ahead and declaw a particular animal or defang a particular animal, that also amounts to cruelty. And in fact, this is prohibited intervention performed on animals. And trimming of the beaks, if you want to trim it, so that is there. But there are certain exceptions which has been also provided. It is something which has been there mentioned. In fact, you have to, like for example, if you want to prevent the reproduction, right, then of course you can go ahead with that, right? So these are some of the proviso clause that they have mentioned. There are also certain prohibitions over over handing over the particular or selling or purchasing of certain animals. So that is something which is there. In fact, it is forbidden to hand over, sell, or even purchase an animal for which continuing which is for which continuing to live would be connected with certain irremediable torment. So, for any purpose, for immediate painless killing, in fact, the purchaser shall kill or have killed such animal immediately in a pain relief manner. That is something which is also there as per the Austrian animal law. And there is an obligation. There is an obligation that whoever has recognizably hurt or, in fact, jeopardized an animal, that particular individual is reasonably expected to grant necessary first aid to the animal. If it is not possible, arrange for such first aid. So, if you are the one who hurt that animal, then you are the one who obliged to grant first aid. With respect to animal experiments, in fact, the animal experiments is something which is also required, right? So they have also special clause under section 10 itself, and Linder government, of course, they implemented this, and this is something which you should also have look at. This is with respect to experimentation because that is allowed, but there is a separate set of guidelines. There is this Animal Experiments Act which shall be applicable with respect to this. Now, there are certain other revenues also relating to the federal law. No, animal transportation. This is something which is again important because to the extent when transportation is involved, loading, unloading of these animals, they are not subject to any provision of Animals Transportation Act Road, or Animal Transportation Act Air, or Animal Transportation Act Railway. So the thing is that with respect to transportation of these animals, they have to take reasonable care, and there should be sufficient ventilation, there should be adequate space, they should be protected against any kind of unfavorable weather conditions, they should have sufficient food and water. The upright position of the container of the transporting animal should be of such nature that it should not affect the health of that particular animal. The container shall also bear a mark indicating such position. So these appearances of transportation has to be taken into consideration, and there is something the Federal Minister for Health and Women also, in consideration of the objectives of Federal Act and several other legislations where scientific knowledge is involved, can also issue certain regulation containing detailed provision with respect to size, characteristics, equipments for the transport containers of the animal. This is the beauty of it. Federal Minister for Health and Women. Federal Minister for Health can issue regulations, directions with respect to specifications of the transporting container. Can you believe it? This is what the Austrian animal law shows us. So, in addition to that, if you refer to something called keeping animals, then you have to go to section, chapter 2, where something called keeping animals. This how when it comes to keeping animals as a keeper, as humans who are the keepers, there are certain qualifications that you have to have. Now, not anyone can be a keeper. There are certain qualifications for keeper also, like everybody who is capable of complying the provision of this federal legislation and regulation should also be in possession of necessary knowledge and capabilities. That keeper of that particular animal is not able to provide any keeping of the animal in accordance with the federal act, then that particular individual should pass it on to a particular association, institution, or person who will be in a position to take proper care. So this is the thing. There is also certain principle which guides that no animal shall be kept unless it is reasonably be expected on the basis of its genotype or even phenotype that it can be kept according to the state of art of scientific knowledge without detrimental effect on the well-being. So, like this, and this is something which you will find this particular legislation talks about everything. It talks about care in case of illness and injury, it talks about freedom of movement under section 16, it talks about feeding and watering under section 17, it talks about, in fact, person who is looking after the animals whether there are sufficient number of staffs possessing appropriate ability, knowledge, and professional skills for taking care of animals. That is also there under section 14. If you want to build a particular accommodation or installation for animals, there is a specification for the same. With respect to, say, example, cages, there is a EU directive also, the EU directive from 1999, which lays down minimal standards for protection of laying hens. There is also building and bringing of services prohibited. Operation of cages is also mentioned. There is another directive from 1999 which also talks about keeping certain systems requirements, which is of course in compliance with the federal act of Austria. But the thing is that whether the animal is in a proper light, in fact, the particular factor is also to be taken into consideration. So the animal should not be kept in permanent darkness, or it should also not be kept in an appropriate situation or where the artificial lighting is too much. So, and because that is, artificial lighting is also related to breeding chicken. So there is an EC directive for the same, which has been kind of implemented under the Austrian animal law. All the European Union are far ahead when it comes to animal rights, even with respect to human rights. But the Austrian animal law has very nicely adopted the EC directives. So there is also a process of inspection, record keeping, breeding methods. In fact, that is something which is also there as regards the same. There are also certain list of injuries and deformatives that has been clearly highlighted under this particular legislation. For all these things, educational training purposes, advanced training purposes, veterinarians and their study, and in a way, this is something which I have already mentioned all these things, and these are relevant with respect to animals. You won't find that kind of specifications, that kind of elaboration, that kind of comprehensiveness in our Prevention Against Cruelty of Animals Act, to be very honest, which I came across in this Austrian animal law, the federal law that they have. Now, when it comes to marking and registration of these animals, in fact, there are certain provisions as regards the same. If you are using an animals in zoos, keeping an animals in zoos or keeping an animals in circus or variety shows and all, there is a clear provision for the same. If you have to refer to section 26 and 27 respectively, under the said law, where there are certain measures which they have clearly specifically mentioned. In fact, in addition to that, if you're also talking about the animal shelters, Section 29 talks about running of animal home shelters that has to be authorized. And at the same point of time, there should be adequate veterinary care for these animals. There should at least be one person with with relevant technical skills and knowledge that is required. In fact, if you are also keeping animals within the ambit of business activities, there also you have to have sufficient number of persons knowledgeable in keeping the respective species of the animal. So you should have that. With respect to slaughtering and killing, slaughtering, killing, transportation, accommodation, immobilization, even anesthetization, or other forms of activities of an animal may be performed only by a person who is in possession of a required knowledge, basically the veterinarians. If it's a ritual slaughtering, then it can be allowed in slaughterhouses specially established and authorized by the authority for this purpose. And if you want to slaughter an animal without anesthesia before exsanguination, it is highly prohibited. So anesthetization is under these circumstances. In the particular case of slaughtering, it is a must. And when it comes to ritual slaughtering, they also have a specifications for the same. The ritual slaughtering, whoever is performing that individual should be having certain knowledge. There should be a veterinarian present while you have ritual slaughtering. In our country, we don't use this term ritual slaughtering. We usually say animal sacrifice, religious sacrifice, right? But the ritual slaughtering is something which is allowed, but they have also specifications for that. There are equipments which is available for that. The slaughter, if it's done is performed in a way where the large blood vessels in the throat area is opened with a single cut or not, that has been also mentioned. So this is something which you will find if you just have a look at this animal welfare law of Austria. All these things are there. Marking and registration of dogs and cats. You have to get yourself registered, the dogs and cat to be registered, because that will also help the authority to keep a track of the keeper of that particular animal. So on and so forth. These are the provisions. When it comes to the penal laws, of course, the person who is inflicting any pain, suffering, injury, whoever is killing an animal contrary to this particular law or between the enactment, who is also carrying out certain interventions on an animal which is contrary to respective sections like section 5, 6 and 7 to be very specific, and whoever is even violating section 8 of the federal act, that individual is committing an administrative offense, and that individual shall be punished by the authority for being imposed a fine up to 7,500 euros. And if it's repeated, then it can also go to 15,000 euros, heavy penalty. You do the math. Even any attempt to do this is punishable. So even if you don't succeed, but if you have attempted, and if it's proved, then yes, that is the thing. So this is what I have for the Austrian animal welfare laws. I insist you just have a look at it, and it will be very interesting, very comprehensive, a bit lengthy law though with respect to animals, but it's very interesting. It will give you a very broad perspectives about the cruelty laws against the animals in other countries. And when it comes to Austria, well, it is one of the best and one of the strictest animal laws country in the world. Thank you very much. So, in the next class, we'll discuss about some other facets of comparative environmental law. Until then, stay safe, stay home, take care.